Welcome to the Scholar Chronicles. I'm Dr. Loh KS, a historian, and in this podcast, I ask fellow scholars to share their stories from the field. These stories are often shared privately and rarely in public, but I think they are very interesting because they shed light on the research we do, the challenges we face in the research, and the wider relationship between scholarship and society. And ultimately, the aim of the podcast is to help scholars do their research a little bit better. With me today, we're going to delve into a big episode, a very dramatic and in some cases traumatic episode in the history of Malaya / Malaysia after the Second World War. So this is the history of the Malayan emergency from 1948 to 1960. This is, of course, part of the Cold War in Southeast Asia. And part of this emergency in Malaya was the mass resettlement of many villages, so-called squatters, throughout the Malay Peninsula, mostly Chinese, but also including the other ethnic groups as well. And of course, this was to starve the Malayan Communist Party of its support as well as its food. Usually, the mass resettlement of these squatters into so-called new villages is seen as a success story, right? And it is seen as one of the means by which the British and the Federation government in Malaya were able to defeat the communists. I mean, about 2 decades later on, the Americans tried to apply the same strategy to Vietnam with the creation of the strategic hamlets, but these never succeeded. So what we're going to do today is, there's been a lot of work done on the history of the emergency and the counterinsurgency campaign, the work of Gerard Templer, for example. But we are not going to look at the military side of the new villages or the policy of the new villages per se. We're going to go inside the new villages to look at the people living there, the social history of the new villages. So we have with us two people, right, who actually did their PhDs on the new villages in Malaya about 40 years apart, right? One of them did the PhD in the early 60s, and the other one did the PhD with me actually in 2005. So, and from very different disciplines, I think it's better for them to introduce themselves and tell us how their work came about. Very much welcome to the podcast, Jack and Teng Phee. Morning to Teng Phee and evening, right, to Jack.
Now, the first time I heard about the new villages was actually in Time magazine. I was trying to come up with a topic for my dissertation, and I saw an article there. And at that time in geography in the US, there was something called central place theory that was very important and new. And the central place theory said that as the communities enlarge, they get more complex economically. So that a small hamlet might have in the US a church, a restaurant, and a gas station. But when you go up the scale of size, then you have more and more complex economic activities. For example, you would not have a brain surgeon in a hamlet. He would have no business. So that when you get up to a large community like New York or London or Singapore, you have a very complex economy with many different professions and activities. So I applied for a grant. I got the grant, a very small grant of $5,000. It was supposed to last me a year. And I bought a ticket and took a trip across Europe and South Asia and arrived in Kuala Lumpur in August of 1963. Like many others, I was trying to be there for the creation of Malaysia. And I was very fortunate in that I made an acquaintance who got me a key to the Merdeka Stadium and I was able to be present when that happened. And then I began to find out exactly how ignorant and how amateurish I seemed to be, because it never occurred to me that the new villages would not speak English and that might not be any way to find housing, and I might need a car, and I didn't know whether my money would cover it. But all of those things seemed to work out like magic. There was a Marine guard at the embassy who was leaving, and he sold me his 1947 MGTC for 280 US dollars. My secretary at the Peace Corps alerted me to a house. I managed to get a house at a reasonable price. So I had transportation, I had housing, and now I had to find out about the new villages.
Jack, could you talk about selecting the subject? How did that come about? I mean, you talked about reading that magazine, but was New Villages even on your radar in the beginning?
No, I just was looking for something in Southeast Asia, as I think you might remember. At that time, as a geographer in the US, I needed to have a region that was my specialty and a topic that was my specialty. So I had Southeast Asia, and I was interested in third world, lower economy housing and squatter areas, slum areas, and housing of the very lowest level was what I was interested in seeing if it would apply to the central place theory. And in fact, I would be able to predict which new villages would grow and which would not. Unfortunately, when I got there and started doing some research, there was almost no information available about the new villages. And I was a little panicked, to be quite honest. I went through all the Straits Times archives, looking at the newspapers. I tried to find other sources of information, but I would find out much later, almost at the end of my time in Malaysia, it was all still classified. Remember, the new villages were created just 5 years after the Second World War ended. And it was only 3 years after the emergency ended that I was trying to do this research. So it was fortunate that I made the acquaintance of Anthony Short, who was a professor at the University of Malaya, and he was doing the official emergency history. And I went to one of his presentations. I discussed what I was trying to do, and he arranged for me to have access to top secret documents up to 1960. And thus I was able to get information that was very difficult to obtain.
All right, thanks, Jack. I just want to, maybe for a bit context, right, just mention the 3 works that Jack has done in the first one I found is Emergency Resettlement and the Chinese in Malaya. The PhD was Population Resettlement in Malaya. So this was with Northwestern University and completed was it in 1971? Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
I was at Northwestern, and I finished my graduate work there at the end of the time I got back. And I began to teach in colleges, universities.
Right. And the third piece of work I managed to find was Resettlement as a Method for Development. So this was a paper you presented at a conference on Asian Studies. Right. Okay, Jack, I'm going to come back to you in a moment because I want to let Teng Phee introduce himself. So Teng Phee, you heard that Jack talked about being an American and flying over, a very unfamiliar and trying to find his way around. For you, new villages was not something new, right? They were very familiar to you.
Yeah. First of all, thank you, Kasing, for having me, and I'm most happy to in person. I think though it's online through June. Yeah, to meet Dr. John Humphrey. Yeah, I think as what Kasing has mentioned just now, it's a classic that I think for everyone who wants to study the topic of Chinese New Village, I think we must read your work. Yeah, so thank you so much. It becomes a very important and useful base for us to study the nature of the emergency and Chinese New Village. Yeah, and unlike Dr. John Humphrey, yeah. So personally, I grew up as a child and young man into Chinese New Village in Malaysia. So my personal experience, in particularly my grandparents, they repeatedly told me about the story of how difficult the lives and circumstances were under so-called the British colonial, very strict colonial government administrated in the village back to the 1950s during the emergency, from 1948 to 60s. So they recounted a frightening story about their friends and their relatives being arrested by the police, and other accounts, local accounts and knowledge that spread through the community, neighboring villages, and across the generation as well. So to me, I think this personal link, set of childhood memories, has led me to a deep yearning on my part to further understand the past of the Chinese in Malaya under the British rule. So these collective memories and personal recollection have also compelled me to undertake this investigation into the social history of the new village during the emergency period. So I think that is my personal journey and to understanding more about my family history. And eventually it became my PhD dissertation topic. And few years back, it turned into a book project.
Yeah, the title of your dissertation and book is Behind Barbed Wire, Chinese New Villages During the Malayan Emergency, 1948 to 1960, published 4 years ago, right? The topic, right, Teng Phee, how did the topic come about for you?
As you know that I was on my supervisor, James Warren. Yeah. So I think he personally would like to, it's more kind of like a history from below. Yeah. So when I try to pick a topic for my PhD, yeah, and it come across to my mind that why not I delve into this topic and try to understand a bit more about my family history. Yeah. So there are two parts, of course. One, we need to locate the archival material, yeah, to see whether we will be able to find the primary resources. Yeah. Second of which, we have to conduct field work. So it's interesting that just now Dr. John Humphrey mentioned about a car.
Please call him Jack. Jack.
Okay.
All right, Jack.
Okay. Jack mentioned about he has to buy a car, right? Yeah. So similarly to my field work, I also need a car. Later we may talk about some interesting story, during our field trip. Yeah, because there are more than 480 new village in the Malay Peninsula. So you need properly a car, yeah, to travel. Yeah. So to me, I think the topic come across to my mind. Yeah, it's mainly because of my grandparents on both sides. My grandparents and maternal grandparents, they were relocated in the 50s, yeah, by the British. Yeah.
So it was a social history, right? It's going to be a social history looking at people's experiences in the new villages, right? Jack, coming back to you, what were the aims of your doctoral study, and what is the method of a geographer?
When I came here, I wanted to actually go out and interview in the villages. But as you indicated, there were a great many of these, and they were scattered up the west coast of Malaysia. Many of them were concentrated in the Perak area around Ipoh and in Johor, with the Kuala Lumpur area being the sort of third largest number of new villages. And I drew up a questionnaire And then that's when I realized I needed some translators, because even if I had spoken Mandarin, the new villages had many different dialects. And so I went to the MCA, which was, of course, one of the governing parties in Malaysia, and said, would you be interested in providing me translators in return for my giving you any information I gathered on them? And I was really lucky, because they said yes, they would provide them. And so I was able to get usually 3 translators with me to handle all the various dialects. And I started in Perak, and there was a large cluster of them. And eventually there were about 155 new villages in the state of Perak. And I took my questionnaire and familiarized the translators with them. And we went out into the field. And I had obtained, fortunately, a plan of each new village that I was going to interview in. And I was able to use a statistical selection of which plots, which houses I was going to go to, based on information that was very sketchy. So I had to sort of take a chance on going to these houses. And it went reasonably well. I had been warned that, those new villages are very dangerous. It was rather like I found in Potong Pasir. I was warned that this was not a good place to go. And the translators seemed a bit nervous as well. But I had absolute cooperation. There were not more, in all of the interviews I did, there were not more than about a handful of people who said they would not talk to us. And I was really surprised at that, because, of course, it was not that long before I was there that they had British troops and resettlement officers and people who were not entirely friendly in the way they treated the people. But these people always cooperated. And we selected information on the dialects, the number of people in the houses, the jobs that they were performing, and got to the general makeup of each household. And I went from Perak down to Selangor, and then on down to Johor. And when I was in Johor, I was very fortunate. I went to the state secretariat to see if they had any information that I could have. And there was a Malay gentleman who was in charge of what was an enormous room full of tan folders with pink ribbons around them. And he knew where everything was. There were enormous stacks, and I would tell him what I wanted, and he would go over to a stack and flip through it and find what I wanted. And I got some really useful information. And the next day I went back and said, I would like to get some more. And he said, no. My superior said, I'm not allowed to give you that information. It's secret documents. You're not supposed to see them. I thought I was finished with my research in the field, other than what I was getting on my own. And then in 1964, I went to this presentation by Tony Short, and he was interested in my resettlement information. And he said that he would see if he could get me clearance for the secret documents in return for having access to my information. And I got that permission, and I also got a small stipend from the federal government. And the security officer for Malaysia had been killed in a motorcycle accident. And so I was put into his office in the Prime Minister's enclave, which was very interesting, because I actually got to say hello to the Tunku as he was walking down the walk one morning when I was heading up to get more documents. And I was given a list by Mr. Short, and he indicated what he wanted me to get, and I also included a few entries myself. And so I got a great deal of information, and as a result of the timing, there is some confusion, for example, about the number of new villages that were created. If you go online and go to Wikipedia, which is written by individuals and not an authorized source, there are many different titles. The number that I finally put together was 390 or 593 new villages. And many of them were very, very small. They essentially were a rubber estate tapper population. And the two largest ones were Jinjiang and Ampang. And Jinjiang, for example, had 13,000 people who were moved into that community. Ampang was not far behind, and they were satellite to the city of Kuala Lumpur. But most of the new villages were anywhere from about 300 to 1,000 people. And they were brought there by the security guards and put into the wired, protected community that was mentioned earlier. And they were not well treated in many instances. They were very roughly treated. The British troops and police that moved them were often rather unsympathetic to them, in part because, of course, there were others in the jungle where they had been mainly, although many were also from rubber estates, tin mines. And it was a difficult life for a rubber tapper or a tin miner. The rubber tappers, for example, were up at 6:30 in the morning and had to get to the estate to start their tapping. And it was often a very long time to get to them. So the British generally tried to rehouse in resettlement communities, the new villages, of people who were going to be near the estate where they were working. Same for the tin miners. And truck drivers and others that were out on the road were resettled close to their place of work. So this was what I began to discover as I was working there. And eventually I compiled a fairly good supply of data and documents regarding the new villages.
Thanks, Jack. So was the aim to conduct a very comprehensive survey of all the 593 new villages?
593.
Yeah, right. So things like household size and number of houses in each, things like that. Income,
there
I
was
guess.
no count of houses. I could count the lots from
Right.
the lots that the houses were on, but I did not actually count the houses. And most of the houses were self-built. And it was interesting from an anthropological point of view that all of these settlers seemed to have a decided idea of what a house was supposed to be like. And they were very simple houses. The British just dropped lumber for them to build the houses. And they all were basically the same design. I had sent you a copy of the design of the houses. And as you can see, they were very, very simple structures. They eventually, by the time I was ready to leave, Ampang and Jinjiang had more substantial houses and perhaps had some commercial or assistance with building their structures because they were much more elaborate.
Right. Was it easy to get access to the new villages in terms of going inside? Did the MCA help you?
Yeah, the wire had been taken down from all of the new villages that I went to. This was in '64, and the wire was gone. The police towers for the guards were gone. And in fact, there were still some remnant of the gates, but you could just walk through and go into the community. And we had our map that showed us which houses we wanted to go to, and we just made the circuit around through the village and without any trouble, without any difficulty.
I want to find out if you visited the new village that Teng Phee grew up in. Teng Phee, what is the name of the new village?
It was in the state of Selangor. Yeah, Jenjarong. I'm not sure whether you have visited that village.
No, I didn't.
No. It's Jenjarong. Yeah. It's in the state of Selangor, Kuala Langat. Yeah. So I think about 20 to 30 kilometers from Klang, Port Klang.
Since I had already wasted over a year of my, I had gone through the year and now I was into my second year and was probably going to have to try and work into the third year if I was going to get anything. I only went to do the interviews in 14 of the new villages, but I selected from the list I had and tried to have a representative sample of the various types that existed. I did Ampang, but I did not do any work in Jinjiang, which is incidentally I read what became a very hotbed of criminal activity after many years, and it now is a place with restaurants and theaters, and it's become sort of an entertainment center, maybe Malaysia's version of the Disney World. I don't know. But that was well after I left the country in 1966.
So Teng Phee, for you, by the time that you were going to the new villages in the mid 2000s, getting access was it an issue, both in terms of finding people to interview as well as getting access to the documents?
I went to my fieldwork in the year 2006. Yeah. And I spent about 1 year stationed in a few places. Yeah. Like Jack, I have stationed in Kuala Lumpur. Yeah. In order to access the National Archive of Malaysia, Arkib Negara. And then I also traveled to various states. Yeah. So what Jack mentioned just now, Perak, Selangor, Johor. Yeah. At that time, one of the questions came to my mind is how actually the new village looked like, after 60 years, from the 1950s onward. By the time I travel and understanding more about the new village. So whenever I travel to each new village, I will go directly to the kopitiam, the coffee shop, and then try to check whether there are elderly people who are more than 70 or 80 years ago that they live in the village and can share their story with me. So this is one of the approach that for me to select. Eventually, there are 4 case studies. And in terms of archival material, I would like to highlight that even you can find the index and also try to retrieve the archival material from the archivist. But I would say at least 3 or 5% of the archive, they might send you back a note, indicate that surit, which means confidential. Yeah. So I also check with the archivist, if this is confidential, what is the process to let the researcher to actually take a look. Yeah. The staff just reply, they will review almost annually, and then you have to wait. By the time they open the file, then you can access it. So I would say in terms of archivist research, the archivists are quite helpful, but when it comes to the confidential files, there are certain percentage that we still can't access. So, but by the time I think I heard about Jack mentioned about Anthony Shaw, who actually introduced him and then to have the access. I'm also curious, the location and whether it's still at Jalan Duta, the Arkib Negara, where the location, the National Archive is today. Yeah.
So Teng Phee, you are talking about Malaysian archives, right? You're not talking about British archives.
No. Yeah.
What kind of documents were you asking for?
There are several categories. First, of course, more open to the public would be government gazette, and those are, I think, we can also easily access in Singapore, which is a Singapore-Malaysia collection. Yeah. Second of which I think is CO file. Yeah. So there are at least several levels. I think one, of course, is further archival material. And then once I decided my case study, the next step would be the state level, meaning they said that in the state of Pahang, yeah. So we need to get the archival material about the new village archival material at the archival center. Yeah, so that's the second part. And the last one will be a few officers who have conveyed the survey. Yeah. So I think the four case studies I chose, basically I need to make sure that I can access a certain level of material. Then we can compile together some basic information about these case studies. And then we can cross-check with the oral history part. Yeah.
So these documents contain things like socioeconomic, housing. Is that kind of information that you're looking for?
Yeah, even with some basic field survey map.
Right. So let me ask you then, how did you find Jack's research, right? Was it useful for you?
Yeah, definitely. As I mentioned, it's a classic. It provides, I think, an overall picture about what is the origin of the emergency problem. Okay, so I think Jack has correctly pointed out that behind the bridge plan, yeah, the main issue is the so-called squatter problem. Yeah, and we all aware that squatters were people that so-called illegally, inverted comma, that occupied jungle fringe, yeah, back to the Japanese occupation, later the post-Second World War. Yeah. So Jack, once he had the opportunity to assess it, I think he did a very good job to put a so-called historical context for people to understand about this resettlement scheme and the origin of this squatter problem. And then more importantly, I think he also illustrate a very clear picture about the initial stage of the so-called resettlement scheme, and what were some of the issues encountered by the government, British authorities, be it federal, state, and ground level. And also, I think in his conclusion, I think find it quite interesting. Yeah. So he actually highlights the benefits of resettlement to certain level. I think no one will argue that the local government development for the new village. Also, they provide the education and services and amenities, and also towards the Malayan identity, through citizenship, yeah, and land title, things like that. And on the other hand, I think Jack also highlights some of the shortcomings about this resettlement scheme. I think in general, he sum up is in a way that some of the villagers, they were poor sighting in terms of selection, yeah, because it was in such a rush way to have several hundreds of new village being set up from 1950s onward. And lastly, I think the Malay and Chinese tension mentioned by Jack, yeah, I think which is from my oral recollection, yeah, I can also sense that the racial issue, yeah, and insecurity, yeah, of the new villages, yeah, is still there. And the other thing, because Jack is a geographer, I think he also pointed out that rural-urban migration patterns. Yeah, I think that is something quite interesting to me. Yeah, because I was trained as a political science. Yeah, and it provides a different aspects for me to look into the emergency, in particularly through the population changes. Yeah, in post Second World War.
Thanks, Teng Phee. I think you have taken up Jack's part already, summarizing his
Sorry.
research. No, I'm sure he doesn't mind, and he can correct you if he wants. Jack, I have a question about the files, right? The secret files that Anthony shot. Were these, you think, similar to the files that Teng Phee had applied for, 40 years later, but was unable to access? So, what kind of documents was it that Anthony shot helped you to get access to see?
They were actually two different categories because I was doing the work for Mr. Short, Professor Short. He was interested more in the military side and how the military patrolled into the government and searched for the shelters and so forth the guerrillas had. My interest was in the new villages itself.
Right.
So when I was getting documents for him, they were largely military and administrative issues, whereas I was interested in the villages themselves.
Mm.
And I would like to mention that one of the problems was for the British, they received very great criticism for some of the things. There was one incident, and that was the only incident I saw any record of, that was called the Malayan My where civilians were killed by the army when they found them in the jungle. They also had very little in the way of resources. I found one document, for example, that in December 1951, it gave an accounting of what had to be put into each new village and the cost, and then how many families, it was family rather than person, were resettled. And it turned out that the total cost, once you bought the land, which was difficult because there were Malay reserves, there were rubber estates, there were tin mines, and suitable land was often not really available within an area where there were a large number of new villages being constructed. So some of the new villages were put on land that flooded when it rained, and which was too far from their jobs, and which was under heavy pressure by the guerrillas, so that they had to, one, buy the land, they had to put in a medical facility, they had to put in a school, they had other costs that were related to getting the people rounded up and getting them there, so that it was determined at that time that the average cost per family was about 520,000 Malayan dollars. That's $500,000 in Malay currency to get these people from where they were picked up to where they were put into a new village, and the new village was brought up to the standard that it was supposed to be. Unfortunately, in the beginning, in 1951 and 52, the pressure was to get the guerrillas and away from the people and get the people into the resettlement villages. So it was done very quickly, and it was not always done well. As I mentioned there, sometimes the sites were very poor and they were not good sites for this, or they did not get good staff to put in the hospitals or the schools. And this was because Britain had lost many of its best troops in the war, and they were rebuilding back home, and there was therefore less money available to come to Malaya. In Malaya, the guerrillas were effectively, in many areas, damaging the rubber estates or killing the staff and killing the staff in the mines and so forth, so that it was done very hurriedly and very fast. It's amazing. They did a large portion of the total resettlement in the first year or year and a half. And as a result, they made so many mistakes that when High Commissioner Gurney was killed on his way up to Fraser Hill, and at the same time there were several incidents where the guerrillas killed significant numbers, sometimes 20 or 30 of the military security services in ambushes, they realized something had to change, that they had to do it a different way. And that's when they began to improve the schools, improve the facilities in the villages, and they began to realize that these people were mainly semi-literate people or people with minimal education. And now they were in a village where they had to form the government for that village, to have a local council. And they realized they had to help educate these people so that they didn't just ruin the opportunity that was being presented. And I found that one of the more important things that happened was, as I'm certain many people already know, the Chinese were not allowed to own land. The Malays insisted that the British not to let them have ownership of land. And that was one of the advantages for them of being in the jungle. So they began to realize they had to give the farmers that they were rounding up a piece of land. And that's one of the main differences between the new villages in Malaya and the strategic hamlets in Vietnam. In Vietnam, they already had their land, and they were being taken off their land and moved into a strategic hamlet that often was almost too far for them to go and farm their crops. And so the availability of land and having a lease on land, they were not given ownership, but they could get a lease on the land, was really a very important element of how the new villages proved to be very useful in trying to defeat the guerrillas.
Of course, one of the main slogan in the counterinsurgency, especially led by Gerard Templer, is of course winning the hearts and minds of the people. So when you were there, Jack, this was for most of them less than 10 years, right? Less than a generation of having moved to the new villages. So the emergency was still quite fresh in many of their minds. Did you feel that the resettled people were kind of, they had given their hearts and minds to the new government at the time? Or were they still struggling to come to terms with the resettlement?
Just before I left, I came across some documents that showed that there was at least beginning to be some slight improvement in the attitude towards the government. As they created a new council, for example, a village council, they became more involved in it. They understood more of the problems of trying to administer these areas. And they were beginning to soften a bit. And the fact that they were getting an education, which is very important to particularly the Chinese resettled people, they could have medical services, and they were now beginning to be isolated from the predatory activities of the guerrillas. The guerrillas were having to come out of the jungle to get to the new villages, and the British were ambushing them and beginning to kill them in good numbers. About 6,700 guerrillas was the number I saw killed by the British troops and the Commonwealth troops. One interesting aside was there were 5 Gurkha brigades when the emergency started, and the guerrillas were absolutely terrified of the Gurkhas because of their kukris. They believed that the kukris were going to be used to cut their heads off, and that their spirit would wander the jungle for eternity. So if the Gurkhas showed up on patrol, they vacated an area very quickly. But the Gurkhas eventually were replaced by British troops in large part because they were now being able to leave Britain and other localities. And incidentally, this was not the only area that there were uprisings, and particularly by the communists. The war was on in Korea, the war was on in Vietnam, the war was on in Africa, and as a result, British troops and administration and the cost was great, so that they had trouble doing the best job they could. And they changed the attitude of the military as well. They were told not to do anything that was so aggressive and so rough. with the resettled people so that they would begin to understand that they could be a part of the country, that they could be part of the populace and not kept off in the jungle somewhere.
Right, Jack. So I mean, Chinese immigrants in Malaya as well as in Singapore actually, before they got integrated right into the state, they tend to be quite nervous and they tend to be quite evasive. When they're speaking to authorities. How was your interaction with the new villagers? Did you find that they were trying to avoid the questions or maybe give misleading answers to your questions?
Based on my research, I learned something while I was refamiliarizing myself with my dissertation over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.
I would not put a whole lot of faith in Wikipedia. Wikipedia had a lot of mistaken penalties. They called them concentration camps, for example. And they were not concentration camps. They concentrated the settlers, true, but they did not treat them like most people's idea about a concentration camp. They're varied in the number of communities. They varied in where they were, what they consisted of, the different types. But that was the advantage I had that they did not have, because I got to see documents that most of them were unable to see because they were not doing research for Professor Short. So that this was a marked change in 1951 when Gurney was killed and when the ambushes were there and when they finally realized that how they were doing resettlement up to that point was not conducive to implementing Arts and Minds program. And after that, they began to work harder to try and facilitate the emotions, the attitudes of the settlers in order to get them to be less familiar with the guerrillas. It must be remembered that during World War II, Mpaja, the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, was largely a communist organization. And the British actually supplied them with weapons and with intelligence. And as a result, many people admired them. They thought they were real heroes. That they bought the propaganda that the guerrillas had thrown the Japanese out of Malaysia. And they also had supported independence. And independence was a very important objective for many of the residents, not just the Chinese, but the Malays and the Indians as well. And as a result, when things began to soften in terms of the treatment that they were given, they realized that there could be a better life for them in Malaysia. And in fact, I found that the larger new villages were more likely to be successful. Many of them were 300 or 200 people, just were too small to survive. And they also, many cases, were estate workers, and the estates wanted them back in their labor lines because it was more efficient. And as a result, they were encouraging those in the new villages established mainly for estate workers, and to a certain extent for the tin miners as well, that they get out of the very small and really, according to central place theory, they didn't provide enough benefits for the people who were in there. They wanted them they wanted to get out and have a more normal life.